Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Finding Solutions channel. We've got myself, Tom, Ryan, Ben, and Lydia. And today I think we have a pretty exciting topic to discuss. We're going to discuss facial recognition and facial recognition specifically for time tracking. So as we look at facial recognition, we really have to talk about biometrics in general. So I guess to introduce the topic, of biometrics. I don't know. Maybe Ryan, you can tell us a few different biometrics that you know about before we dive in, kind of the facial recognition and the history there.
Yeah, put me on the spot here.
Yep,
Yeah, and I
of
think as
course.
far as like biometrics go, there's a lot of different things, right? Anything from ear, vein reader, hand, fingerprints, probably one of the most common ones. Iris. So
Yeah, I can't say
there's
I've
a
ever
lot of
seen
different ones.
an ear clock where you put your ear up to the clock, but I
Yeah,
do know
I'm
I have heard the ear is a great biometric, and that maybe for military uses and other
yeah.
places they use it. But yeah, that's a great point. So everybody kind of knows about biometrics. I mean, every new iPhone uses facial recognition, and so it's really become popular. And I guess today our hope is we're going to just cover why is facial recognition better than all of those other biometrics for timekeeping? And we're really specifically talking about timekeeping here today. So to start, I thought it'd be good if we just covered kind of the history of biometrics. I don't want this to be a deep dive into the history, but I think it's useful to know that the biometric process was invented for crime fighting. And it was a Frenchman. He was an anthropologist. I don't speak French, so forgive my pronunciation, but Alphonse Bertol, how do you say that, Ryan? Bertillon?
Probably Bertillon. Yeah,
Yeah, there you go. I knew Ryan could do it.
I don't know.
Um, but yeah, back in like 1870s, so this really isn't that long ago. He kind of had a thought that if they could do some measurements on a criminal, and that they could identify that same person later. And so what he did is he took photos to start, and he started doing different measurements. And this is kind of where facial recognition was born. So it really has to do with ratios. So distances from parts of your nose to the corner of your eyes, for example, and your mouth. And I'm not going to get into all the technical parts of facial recognition, but he really did pioneer the work that was done for what would become later facial recognition. The problem is without computers, it really was not a great solution. Of course, we all know fingerprints were used in crime fighting and have been used. Eventually, DNA is really the gold standard, and that's a form of biometric that's very unassailable. And the advantage of that, it's left behind. But yeah, facial recognition has a deep, rich history. But until computing came along, it really wasn't used that much. So if we go forward, we really want to talk about why facial recognition wins with specifically time tracking. And there's three key areas we're going to really touch on today. And that is number one, unlike a fingerprint, a face is human readable. So, or an ear or a voice or iris or anything else that's human readable. And we'll talk a little bit about the advantage of that and why in some ways that doesn't matter for biometrics for certain uses of it, but for time tracking, it actually turns into a huge advantage over these other approaches. Number two, the prevalence of cameras. Number three, super easy to use. And so let's dive in real quick with readability. I don't know, Ben, maybe you could talk first about this one a bit. So why is readability important for biometrics within, say, like time tracking?
Well, it's important to if there is like a flagged like punch, for example, with time tracking, to be able to have somebody to review that. So, um, if you're doing fingerprints, it's hard for somebody to say like, well, this is the fingerprint we know they have, and here's the one we actually got. Well, it's kind of hard from the human, eye to determine who actually it was. With facial recognition, it's a little bit easier to see. Oh, well, this is what they look like when they punched, and it's clearly not them. And so the QA process there is just a lot easier. So
Yeah, and the way we would put it too is that the facial recognition is the oldest biometric on the planet, right? We talked about crime fighting and all the measurements, but all humans do facial recognition.
Yeah, I
I
was just gonna say we were born to do
that's
that. I mean,
right.
that's the we're unless you're I guess if you're born blind, but we're as humans born to be able to recognize faces and and that we do that from as babies.
Yeah, I think it's the only biometric I know of. I guess they probably can do some study on smell and some other stuff, and
Probably
of course
voice
sound
maybe
of,
too,
yeah,
but
sound of a voice for sure. But certainly facial recognition is the best one. If I go fly in a plane, what's the biometric that they're using? And I have a picture of it here up. It is facial recognition, and you don't need a computer to do it. We talk about the measurements and all of that, but humans are super geared toward recognition. Our brains do that easily.
So you kind
So
of bring up a
yes.
good point there too. Like in like at the airport, if a system were to go down and fail, like face
Mhm.
recognition, where they're automatically letting people through now, like I've last time we flew, they just had to step up and they scan our face. They don't ask you for your ticket anymore. But if that system were to go down for some reason, it's easy to fall back on the gate agent there can just start looking at IDs and matching them up with the people that are there. So
Yeah, that's a great point. It is the backup system, and it's a backup because it's human readable. They could do, like, why not have your finger go on a scanner and then the agent looks at your fingerprint, looks at some fingerprint on your card? Well, it's not human readable. There's
yeah.
really no good way to do it. It is, I mean, if you're an expert at fingerprint recognition, but not for lay humans. So yeah, great point. And then Ben, what you were talking about, I guess that's the point for time tracking, is because there's a problem with biometric. There's kind of a dirty little secret with biometrics, with time tracking, that actually doesn't get talked about a lot. And that's what we call false negatives. So we often think of biometrics trying to solve a problem of false positives. And I'll define what those two things mean. But a false positive is, if Lydia here, you come to work for me, right? And I don't want to go to work today. Let's say that I'm a neurosurgeon. I don't feel like it. I feel like staying home, and I'm going to have you go perform brain surgery instead of me. And you go to a clock and you go to punch in. Most biometrics are focused on this idea of, well, we are going to make sure it really is Tom that's going into work today. And by the way, you'd probably do a better job on brain surgery than I would, even if I was trained and you weren't. But the point is, that's a false positive. It's the primary purpose of biometrics, which is to make sure it really is the right person doing the work. When I use my phone to log into my bank account, and I happen to have an iPhone and I hold it up and it does Face ID, that's making sure there's not a false positive. I can't have some stranger pick up my phone, get in and look at my balance and transfer a bunch of money to themselves. But the bigger problem isn't false positives. Although false positives are the core problem being solved, it's false negatives. And the false negative is the opposite. And that is, it really is me. I'm Tom. I'm trying to go in and clock in, or I'm trying to get into my bank account and it doesn't recognize me and it doesn't let me in. And that's a huge problem. We have that with passwords all the time. Think of all the times you've tried to log into some account with your password and it doesn't let you in. It is a huge pain. And it leads to a whole bunch of problems. So if I have a fingerprint reader and I go put my finger on it, and my wife cuts hair, so her fingerprints are worn off, it wouldn't read her finger. The old iPhones, it wouldn't read her finger. And that's a false negative. It really caused a bunch of problems with time tracking. It causes some headaches for supervisors, for sure. So false negatives are inevitable. The system, quote unquote, going down, like Ryan mentioned for the TSA, is kind of inevitable, right? So if there's an edge case where it can't recognize a face and it's a false negative, the only choice you have is to move on and either block them from punching in, or you punch them in and you generate some kind of like an exception or something. So I don't know, Lydia, maybe why don't you explain, like, in your view, why is a photo of a person and letting them punch in, how does that tie into human readability, and how do we get rid of false negatives when it comes to that?
Well, I think it helps with accountability and also security. Just knowing that, like, the right person's going to be at the site where you send them, and you don't necessarily have to be there babysitting them to make sure they're there, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And if they can't punch in, they can still go to work, right? And then the beauty is, because it's human readable, somebody like this TSA agent can examine that photo later. Unlike fingerprint, on all these other biometric processes, if it can't find the person, they can still go to work, and some supervisor or an administrator can look at that photo later after the fact and decide, oh, okay, this really was the right person. And for time tracking, because time tracking is not the same as getting on a plane or getting into a bank vault or even logging into an account for my bank, you can delay the authentication until afterward in these very rare edge cases where it can't be identified. So let's say 99.9% of the time, the computer can recognize a person, no problem. That very small fraction of the time, the person can still get into work, go to work, and then it can be dealt with later. So that's why human readability is so important. So let's go to the next one here. So the next idea is cameras are everywhere.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, no, it is. It's Big Brother. I mean, every technological advancement has a pro and con to it. There's always this idea of we advance, our society moves forward, we can automate something, but it can also be used for improper uses as well. But this is where I go back to, we're not talking about facial recognition for me walking down the street. I would be the first to raise my hand and say, I'm totally against that, right? I don't want cameras everywhere and tracking every movement I'm in. But when you're at work, the employer has a right to know that you're there. I mean, they could stick a supervisor next to you all day, and isn't that a pair of eyes? Isn't that a camera of the company with you, determining what you do? So I think the idea that cameras are everywhere means that the employer knows that it is really you when you punch in through biometrics. And the advantage is they can basically use almost any device on the planet to do it. It's really convenient because I don't have to buy an iris reader or an infrared camera to read your veins in your finger or something like that.
I was just going to say, I think that's super important for mobile workforces in particular, just because, you're not at one location where typically some companies are going to have management there. But if you've got a mobile workforce that's out in the field, doing field work, especially going to different locations, you can't probably always have a supervisor there. It's nice to know that, if you're sending one of your employees to, like, say, somebody's house, to do some work, that it's your employee that's showing up at that house. And there's a lot of, I think, benefits and value of that there with having the picture of the person, but also kind of a guarantee that it is your employee that is on site at your client's or your customer's location.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, completely. It really allows for any of these devices on a mobile workforce to be used as a clock.
From an employee's perspective, I know that the camera's there and that's how I'm punching in. And so I'm going to know that I want to wear my uniform because I know that picture might be reviewed, make sure I'm presentable. And so it keeps me to a higher standard as well, just knowing that that's how I'm going to be punching in.
Yeah, it didn't motivate you to shave today, though, you're on camera. So
I've been missing
but
a
if,
little bit. So yeah,
it's part of the look, Tom.
For the record, I didn't either. But yeah, no, that's a great point. The visible camera, the cameras are everywhere, but you get a lot more than just biometric with a camera. You get this ambient data. You can see the background. Are they in front of the right room? Are they in the right room? Are they in front of the right building? How do they look if there's dress and grooming standards? Yeah, that's a great point that a lot of people wouldn't consider.
Yeah. I think even in some extreme cases, you can see where an employee, punches in from their car, and maybe they're not supposed to be punching in from their car. I know we've seen an extreme circumstance where one lady actually punched. She still had the pillow behind her head. So she might want to try a little bit harder next time. But, that is nice to have that picture to kind of, as you're reviewing punches, just kind of see, it's my employee, but yeah, are they where they're supposed to be?
Hey, if she's really working before she rolls out of bed, maybe that's just fine. But hey, the employer should know that, right? If she's on the clock and they're paying her, having a pillow behind her head maybe is not the best thing. Yeah, great point. And I think the other point here, I guess I would make is that I think any camera, any device within the last 10 years, maybe. I mean, it's been a long time since a device was made that's an Android or iOS device that doesn't have a front camera on it. They're everywhere, from I think as cheap as $40 or $50 tablets that are Android have cameras. They're capable of doing this facial recognition. So it's just the fact that it's so convenient to find a device that can do this biometric. And that's just not true of fingerprint readers, iris scanners, palm readers, and these really obscure ones like ear readers. I've even heard of like how you walk or the way you stand. They're all biometrics. They just don't have sensors everywhere. It's harder to get at that data.
I bet we wouldn't even have had, oh, real quick, just fingerprint scanners. If there were cameras that have been around for 50 years, we would have skipped the whole fingerprint scan. That would be out the door. And we would have always, we'd be all on facial recognition. But now we're 20 years into facial recognition, and everywhere there's a camera. So now we're kind of turning towards it everywhere. So,
yeah, great point. Yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but that's the other really bad thing about these other modalities. We talked about it being human readable, but if the fingerprint doesn't scan, I can't go to work. So not only are these sensors everywhere, but if the fingerprint or the iris or something can't read it, which is inevitable, then I have no recourse but to get a supervisor involved and to really just cause more time. So that plays into this idea that all these devices are everywhere. All right, the last point we're going to make, then we're going to wrap up, is, man, everybody can take a selfie. It's really not hard anymore. Just a quick story on this one. We started facial recognition time tracking, I think it's been 11 years ago now. I mean, it was a long time ago. And at the time, the word selfie did not exist. I can attest to that because we were trying to figure out if people would be uncomfortable holding their phone up, and taking their own picture. We actually had that conversation. I remember having the conversation. We had some investors quiz us on that. Would people be too uncomfortable? And society has changed so drastically since then. This is like one of the least of our concerns now. Everybody can take a selfie. People are very comfortable with the idea of stepping in front of either their own phone or a tablet.
Yeah. Plus, back then you had the old Nokia phones, which had a rear camera, so you had to flip a flip phone around and then try and get something. Yeah, it's a lot easier.
Yeah, even 11 years ago, we had to address the whole dumb versus smartphone kind of conversation. So for sure, that's true, and you had to hold it differently. So yeah,
kind of
I
makes
just
me
think
think about with selfies. Everybody's always taking photos of themselves and trying to like they make the nice smile or whatever. But what's kind of cool about this is it's additional data for me as a manager to be able to get in there and see the disposition of my employees as well. Are they cranky? Are they upset? Are they sleepy? Are they happy and making happy faces when they punch in? So there's a lot of you can gather some emotional intelligence around how your employees are doing from the data. Being able to review those the photos as well that go with that face recognition.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. There's more ambient data than just dress and appearance and where they are and what they're doing. People are so used to taking photos, they're going to kind of betray their current mood as well. And over time, and we can debate how big brother this is, right? But the reality is, from the beginning of time, if I'm an employee and I have a relationship with an employer, once I'm on the clock, there's a reasonable expectation that the employer has rights to know how you're performing for them. And every business is going to be different. Some businesses are very high trust. This culture of trust is important, but the idea that I could know the mood of my employees might be really important for me. It's important not just for me as an employer, but it's important for me to be able to take care of my own employees. If I'm a good employer, I want them to be happy. I actually want them to enjoy what they're doing, because that means they're going to do it for me longer.
It's huge for employee retention.
Yeah, retention. The labor market is so tight in the world, and by all indications, it's only going to get tighter for blue collar workers, especially, in particular blue collar. White collar, not as much from what I'm reading, but no doubt for blue collar, which are typically the type of workers that are going to be punching in and out. So it's really easy. If you have to try to figure out how to use a fingerprint reader or a hand reader or an iris scanner, what do you have to do? Get up there. Those other biometrics are much more difficult to learn. And one thing we all know, whenever you're implementing something new, the frontline employees are always going to be a little resistant to it. So the easier it can be for them, the better.
Yeah, I don't know. You kind of talked about this before, Tom, but maybe it's worth just making a final comment on that security versus convenience. I think that's something that's really played well for us as we've worked on face recognition over the years, and especially in the timekeeping solution. Trying to find something that's not only secure but also convenient because for that reason you just mentioned.
Yeah, you're exactly right. On one extreme, we could do a little fingerprint, draw some blood, do a DNA test before we let somebody come into work. But of course, that's the extreme of being non-convenient, right? If it's too inconvenient, nobody would use it. No employer would use that. I mean, unless you're, some highly secure government or something, or in the movie Gattaca. But for the other end of the spectrum, where there's no security and it's just convenient, I just write my time on a piece of paper, 8 a.m., 5 p.m. every day, and I might get there at 8:20 and I leave at 4:50. That's the ultimate convenience. I mean, it's very convenient for me to do that, but there's no security. So I think, Ryan, you've hit it. We feel like this facial recognition is the perfect balance between security and convenience. And if you want to get better false positive rates, there are better systems for that. But they don't really buy you anything because they're too hard to implement. And because they have false negatives, they really undermine the security anyway. And we won't go into that now, but a false negative, meaning it's really me. I'm trying to read my iris. I'm trying to get in. I can't do it. Who do? I pull my supervisor over and they punch in for me anyway. And if the supervisor isn't honest, then he might punch my cousin in for me. And that's a problem. Or he might fudge the time when he puts it in. So this balance between security and convenience, I think, is super important. And having the ability for people to take their own photo, just like they do for Instagram and Facebook, means it's super easy.
Yeah, it's as easy as taking a selfie.
You can't put an iris scanner
Absolutely.
with a mobile employee. There's no way. This is the most convenient way to do it. Everyone's got a phone. So in this mobile employee age, just use the phone.
Absolutely. Yeah, that kind of plays in with the ubiquity of cameras for sure. All right, well, we're going to close out here. I just want to do a quick recap as we close. We feel pretty strongly, after over a decade of experience, that facial recognition really does win for biometrics for time tracking. It's not as suited for other uses. We'll acknowledge that, but for time tracking, for these three reasons we just highlighted, it really is such a fantastic use of it. And it's really easy. It's really convenient to find devices. And of course, it's the perfect balance of security and convenience, as we've just said. So we want to thank everybody who's joined us and watched this episode, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.